just tell you, you won't be unexpected, that the same rules, as it were, apply today as they did on Wednesday, given the security arrangements that naturally apply to someone who occupies the position of our witness. So please, at any break, would you remain in your seats until the Chancellor has left? Thank you. Chancellor, good afternoon. Let me explain the arrangements. You'll probably have an idea what they are, but your audience will number in 4 figures. Many are here in front of you. They are participants in the inquiry. At their back, there are representatives of the press. To your left are lawyers representing various different interests in the inquiry. There is a room downstairs, and otherwise people are watching by YouTube live stream. So that's your audience. In a moment or two, Mary will ask you to take the oath again. You've been here before, one of the rare witnesses to have that privilege. And Ms. Richards will ask you the questions, I think, as before. Mary.
Mr. Hunt, welcome back. In terms of the roles you have held, you have been a Member of Parliament since 2005, I understand.
Correct.
You were Secretary of State for Health and Social Care between 2012 and 2018.
Correct.
And it was in that capacity that you gave evidence, or in that former capacity that you gave evidence to the inquiry last year.
Yes.
You were then Foreign Secretary between July 2018 and July 2019.
Yes.
You were not then in government thereafter, but you have been Chancellor of the Exchequer since the 14th of October 2022, and it's in that capacity that you're giving evidence today.
Yes.
I want to start by asking you some questions about the role of the Treasury and the Treasury's decision-making processes in general terms. And I want to start by looking at what you previously told us about that, at that stage, from your perspective as someone who'd been Secretary of State for Health. Lawrence, could we please have INQY 1000235? This is the transcript of your evidence last summer, Mr. Hunt. And if we could go to, it should be electronic page 7, I think. So if we pick it up towards the bottom of the page. So if we zoom in on the bottom half of the page, please, Lawrence. And I'm going to pick it up the bottom left-hand column around line 22. You said there, the way the system works in Whitehall is that any big spending decision requires Treasury approval, and if there's a disagreement with the Treasury, you can go to the Prime Minister. And then you refer, top of the next column, to the time you were then concerned with number 10 and number 11 singing from the same hymn sheet. And then you talked about if you needed more money than was in the departmental budget, then you would obviously have to go to the Treasury. You had a pretty good idea the answer would be no, given the overall state of public finances. And then, I don't think we need to go to the further references, but you told us also, by way of summary, about the process of obtaining funding during spending reviews, and the basic rule being no additional substantial amounts of funding outside of spending reviews. But you also told us, I think, of an occasion where you were able to secure an extra £8 billion outside of a spending review process. You told us also that if the Prime Minister was behind something, it was a lot easier to get it, but that in general terms, the Treasury's job was to say no to lots and lots of spending requests. So that was what you told us from your perspective as a spending department. Does that remain a broadly accurate description of the process now from your perspective as Chancellor?
I probably wouldn't use the word the Treasury's job is to say no. The Treasury's job is to balance the national accounts and make sure we can pay for the things that we choose to pay for, and that the taxes that we get pay for that, and that the economy is as healthy as possible. But yes, it is the Treasury's job to make sure we spend money within our means.
And just in terms of spending reviews, is this correct? The 2021 spending review set departmental budgets up to 2024-2025, is that correct?
Correct.
So when is the next spending review?
It will start in April 25.
Can we take it that in terms of the securing of funding for a compensation framework for those infected and affected, whatever it might ultimately look like, that's going to be looked at outside of the spending review process?
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to give you an answer which I may give you more than once this afternoon, but we are genuinely in a situation where no decisions have been made about the level of compensation or how it will be funded. We're in very active and detailed discussions about all of that, but I can't therefore be drawn on where that funding would come from.
I suppose my question more, Mr. Hunt, is about timescales, because if the next spending review is not until, as you've described it, that would postpone decision-making for a significant period of time and might not be said to be in accordance with the priority which the Prime Minister and others have told us that is attached to this issue within government. What can you tell us, if anything, about then timescales, if you're not able to tell us about sources of funding?
Well, what I can tell you is that we totally understand the urgency of this situation. You know, we recognise the fact that, as I think I wrote in a letter before I was Chancellor, that one person is dying approximately every 4 days, and that there is a need for justice to be as quick as possible for what has been a terrible scandal. So we completely understand that, and so that is a very active consideration in all the discussions that we're having.
Okay. Can I then perhaps ask you a little about, again, what you said last year about the stance of the Treasury? Now, you told us that compensation was something that the Treasury, at the time that you were Secretary of State for Health, so looking at the 2012-2018 period, was opposed to. The references for that, if anyone needs it, I'm not proposing to put it up on screen unless it would assist you, Chancellor, but it's pages 15 and then internal page 87 of the transcript. But you also told us that the whole question of a public inquiry was something that hadn't happened sooner, precisely because the Treasury feared that it would lead to recommendations for compensation. And that was your very clear understanding and clear evidence. That was a major factor as to why there had been no public inquiry. Now, that's obviously potentially a matter of concern and interest now, when the inquiry has made recommendations for compensation. Are you able to give us, without committing to any particular decisions, are you able to give us an assurance that the Treasury no longer has that implacable opposition that you told us about last summer?
I want to be as helpful as I possibly can, but you understand, indeed, we discussed last week, I have to follow collective responsibility. And I think it's worth me explaining to everyone, if I may, Ms. Richards, why this isn't a stalling tactic. But government only works because all government ministers stick to an agreed position for the whole government. Otherwise, we just wouldn't be able to deal with having effective government at the same time as a free and open press. So I have to speak in a way that reflects the whole government's position. As a former health secretary, when I came before the inquiry last time, I spoke very freely about the difference between my view and running the Department of Health and the Treasury's view and Number 10's view, and we discussed lots of documents that show the differences in their views. What I can say very clearly is that the government's position, the whole government's position, has changed, because in December we accepted the moral case for compensation. So I hope that gives comfort to people that the government as a whole is not taking the stance that it took during the period that I was Health Secretary.
Can I then just ask you a little about the process that the government will be following in terms of decision-making regarding funding? Now, again, I'm not asking for details of meetings, I'm not asking for details of costings or of options, but just to broadly understand the process and how far along, again, in general terms, you are. If we just look at WITN 3499036, please, Lawrence. So this is your response to a letter from Mr. Quinn as part of a ministerial right round. We looked earlier this week with Mr. Quinn at his letter to you. This is your letter back on the 15th of December with the policy clearance from the Home Affairs Committee for the acceptance of the moral case for compensation. Can we just look to the bottom of the page, please, Lawrence? So we'll see the last paragraph says, you can proceed on the conditions that CO, so Cabinet Office, lead discussions around affordability and secure any associated funding with HMT. So is it correct to understand from that in broad terms the process is that a government department, in this case the Cabinet Office, will effectively, at whatever stage is regarded as appropriate, make a case to the Treasury in relation to funding?
I mean, that is the way government works in normal circumstances. So you could take any government department, let's say the Department for Education, and the Secretary of State for Education will have a budget that's agreed at a spending round, and she will have a limit, let's say £50 million, £100 million. These sound large sums of money, but in the context of a budget of 40 to 50 billion pounds, they're relatively small sums of money where she can just make a decision on her own. If it was above the departmental spending limit, she would have to refer that decision up to the Treasury, and we would approve it or say we've got concerns. So in this situation, I think it goes without saying that the sums of money are likely to be potentially very large. So it will be a standard practice that a line like that will be put in a condition for proceeding.
Now, you gave us some dates in your witness statement of dates on which you had been updated or provided with advice. And again, I stress my questions about the process. I'm not asking you to tell us what the advice was that you received. But if we just look at your statement, so WITN 3499034, please, Lawrence. And if we can go to paragraph 11. 11 and 12, I think it is. Thank you. So you tell us in paragraph 11 you received advice on the 22nd of February on the fiscal implications of the policy options being considered. And you've told us that there was an emphasis from your officials on the imperative to act quickly for the benefit of the infected and affected to respond meaningfully to the public inquiry whilst recognising the wider economic and fiscal context. I'll come back to that last phrase later, Mr. Hunt. You then refer to receiving advice on the 18th of May and then having received a note on the 21st of June. Now, it may be that viewed within government, those sound like quite speedy steps. We've had evidence, and I think we discussed it last year, Mr. Hunt, from a number of ministers, but Sir John Major's evidence comes to mind immediately, describing the process of government reaching new decisions as turning around a supertanker, something that's quite slow. There's a 3-month gap between the 22nd of February and the 18th of May. Is that, are you confident that's consistent with the government working at pace, which is the phrase that has been repeatedly used, but which you'll appreciate many of those listening find frustratingly nebulous.
No, I do appreciate that, and I do appreciate that the way government works might seem frustratingly slow, but I am absolutely content that the government has been acting at pace, because it isn't just me. I obviously have a very important role in this, but the structure that we have set up to address this issue is a small ministerial group across Whitehall. I asked ahead of this appearance how many meetings have happened this year, and it's about 50. And there's been a meeting at official level every week, and the small ministerial group, of which I'm not part, but the Treasury is represented because the Chief Secretary of the Treasury attends, that's met 4 times. And the process is that essentially officials do a huge amount of detail work. Then there are ministerial meetings to progress the issue, and then finally that small ministerial group will make a recommendation to myself and to the Prime Minister. So there has been a lot of work that's happened, and I think in my own case, I think since the second interim report that the Chair produced, I think I've had 10 meetings where we've discussed this issue, and I've had 6 detailed submissions. So over a period of about 3 months, I think that does represent quite regular engagement.
Leaving aside any question of waiting for the final report before a decision is taken, because I'm going to come on to that later, but in terms of the Treasury's own processes and government's own processes, are you able to give any kind of sense of how far along the journey the government has reached? Does it have now, Mr. Quinn used the word building blocks, and that was, I think, from his perspective as the Cabinet Office Minister. From your perspective, it has much of the underlying work been done so that what's left is now the decision-making primarily?
I think there are some very big issues that are raised both in Sir Robert Francis's compensation study and the first and second interim reports, which you may want to talk about at some stage later, but you know, the constitutional implications of a novel arm's-length body being set up and able to make decisions wholly independently of ministers and government. The economic implications, because the kind of sums are potentially very large. The fiscal implications, that's to say the implications for taxpayers. Again, the sums of money are potentially very large. Given the scale of what we could potentially be talking about, I do think that good progress has been made. There is more work to do, but the purpose of making this progress and the purpose of having those 50 meetings and, you know, hundreds of emails flying around Whitehall is because we want to be in a position to avoid any unnecessary delay when the final recommendations and the report, your final report, Chair, is published, because we recognise the urgency. So I think the purpose of the government commissioning Sir Robert Francis's report and all this work now is essentially to make sure that we don't have a situation where the final report is published and then there's a further long unnecessary delay because the government has to crunch through all these details. But if I could just perhaps give some context to the families who are listening. One of the things you asked me about when I appeared a year ago was some of the things I'd written in a book called Zero. And one of the things I said in that book was that I thought the NHS needed a long-term workforce plan. And I was able to announce that the NHS would have a long-term workforce plan in November last year. That then was announced finally 8 months later. There were 100 meetings and I think thousands of submissions and bits of information, and that was a £2.4 billion piece of work. So it is, I just say that, not because we want any delays beyond what are strictly and absolutely necessary, but it is very normal when you're talking about large sums of money for a lot of work to go into these processes.
Would it be right to understand that when you're talking about your perspective on the work that's being undertaken, you're talking about the time since you've been in government?
Yes, but I would say that I think it was, if I look before the time I was in government, shortly after I'd given evidence to you last year, I wrote alongside Andy Burnham and Matt Hancock to urge the then government to make the interim payments of £100,000. And although that finally happened when I was Chancellor, the decision to do that happened before I was Chancellor. And I think that we did need Sir Brian's second interim report because I think one of Robert Francis's recommendations was that we should review our approach following the publication of Sir Brian's response. And so I think having that second interim report published this April has allowed a lot more work to happen at pace than was previously possible.
In relation to those interim payments last summer, and again, just talking about the timescales for decision-making rather than anything else, we know from the witness statement of Nadeem Zahawi, who was at that point the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that the Chancellor's approval was sought and given within an 8-day period in August of last year. Now, I appreciate, of course, that the sums of money involved in relation to those interim payments, although not insignificant, are not of the same magnitude of an entire compensation framework for those infected and affected. But what part does political will play in speeding up the process? Because I don't know if you've seen, as well as Mr. Zahawi's statement, Kit Malthouse's statement, but he gives some insight into having the heft of senior politicians involved, having the approval of number 10, wanting to push something through quickly. How much of a difference does that make?
Yeah, of course it makes a big difference. I mean, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are very senior in the government, and if they consider something to be a priority, it happens quickly. I think there was something else happening here as well, which is that the then Prime Minister knew that his time would be coming to an end in early September, and so that was part of the reason for me writing the letter that I wrote when I did, because I was hoping that he might think it was something that he wanted to do before he stepped down, which indeed was the case, so that may also have been a reason why it happened quickly.
I want to turn to some newspaper articles and the information that's contained within them. So if we could have, please, Lawrence, RLIT 302137. So this is published in the Financial Times, and it's the 10th of May 2023. And you'll see it says this in the left-hand column: the compensation bill for those affected by the NHS contaminated blood scandal could reach £10 billion, according to officials, in a further blow to the UK's stretched public finances. There's then reference in the next two paragraphs to the next paragraph, I should say, to the moral case being accepted. There's then reference to ministers only now coming to terms with the financial hit. Government officials have told the Financial Times that the compensation scheme might cost £5 billion to £10 billion. Given the tight nature of the public finances, officials from the Treasury and the Department of Health have been holding recent talks over how a compensation scheme would be structured. We're working through the options, said one government insider. Another official said people are very worried about the cost, and then it said that the government declined to comment. Now, Do you know whether the officials who are quoted here were Treasury officials?
Absolutely not. I'm afraid there are leaks occasionally from government, and I've got no idea. What I can absolutely assure you is that those leaks did not happen on the say-so of myself or anyone in my ministerial team. You know, we wouldn't want to do that because we're still trying to get our heads around the very complex issues involved.
Can we then look at the second article, which is RLIT 0002136? Now, this is the 2nd of July 2023, so it's almost just under 2 months later. And this is, I'm trying to remember which newspaper this one was, the Sunday Telegraph. So we can see again from the left-hand column, there's a figure now could total more than 20 billion, so it's doubled or quadrupled depending upon which end of the scale in the previous article you takes. Ministers have examined financial modelling, which places the upper forecast at the mid-20 billions. The figures, of course, concern in Whitehall because the potential amounts involved are so large they would affect the government's wider fiscal plans. And ministers do not know where the money is coming from, with the compensation at present completely unfounded, the Telegraph has been told. Are you able to say what the source of those leaks was in terms of department? I'm not asking for individual names. Or are you able to confirm whether it was the Treasury or not?
I can absolutely confirm. I don't know where the leaks came from. You know, most of the time when leaks happen, they are things that ministers don't welcome. They make our life more difficult and they shouldn't happen. What I can say is that there's been absolutely no sort of ministerial, or certainly as far as I'm concerned or Treasury ministers are concerned, any desire to put numbers into the public domain and for whatever reason it might be. You know, I think it's very unhelpful when these leaks happen, and so at a ministerial level, we are absolutely not responsible for them.
And if it's not at a ministerial level, then unless it's been made up by the journalists, and we're talking here about the Financial Times and the Sunday Telegraph, it doesn't seem very likely that that would be the case, but if it's not at ministerial level, it has to be at official level, civil service level. The concern that might give rise to, going back again to your evidence last year, you told us about what you described in a memorable term as institutional inertia. And other witnesses have told us about the groupthink. I think we discussed groupthink as well, Mr. Hunt. Former Secretaries of State for Health preceding you have told us or given us similar accounts of civil service resistance to policies or decisions. And the fact that these leaks are being made of what's said to be upper forecasts and concern, they might tell us something, might they not, about the mindset of the civil servants and officials, because the purpose of the leaks would look to be a scaremongering process. There's no particular good reason why this material should be out there in this form otherwise.
I think it's, if I may very politely say, I think it's quite unwise to speculate on the motives of people who do leaks, because there are many different reasons why people can do it. But I would say that, you know, the overwhelming majority of civil servants want to do their very best to do what they think ministers would like them to do. They have a very strong sense of living in a democracy and doing their best for the elected politicians of the day. And so I think, you know, I can absolutely say, hand on heart, I've not come across any sense from the officials I've dealt with that, you know, they don't want to see this terrible scandal resolved justly. I think they are very, very difficult decisions, very complex decisions, very big decisions, and we are all looking at them from every single direction to fully understand them. But there's there's absolutely no sort of Sir Humphrey-like desire to frustrate ministers or to make ministers do anything other than just fully understand the situation from every angle.
There's one further newspaper article I just wanted to ask you about as well, which is RLIT 0002147, please. So this is July, it's the 17th, the date at the top there, sorry, July the 16th, Sunday Times. And if we could go on, please, to, it's page 4, Lawrence. Yes, if we pick it up in the third paragraph, Hunt, so that's a reference to you, has held several meetings in the Treasury to discuss compensation packages for the victims. This week, he and Sunak are expected to discuss options before they appear before the inquiry. If we follow further down, please. And then this, the Treasury estimates total payouts from the scandal could range between £5 billion and £22 billion. The drastic variation arises because the two reports on the scandal approach compensation differently. Now, Mr. Hunt, I'm assuming you looked at the second interim report of the chair. It certainly wasn't the inquiry's perspective that there was a radical difference between the inquiry's recommendations and those of Sir Robert Francis. Indeed, the report says in terms something to the contrary. And such differences as there are between the two reports, it seems difficult to see how that could make a fourfold difference in terms of magnitude. Is this an accurate statement of the Treasury's understanding of the position, that the two reports approach compensation so markedly differently that you get those two figures?
Well, without sort of trespassing on the principle that I shouldn't be saying what our thinking is before a decision's been made, all I can say is that I don't recognise that statement either. And that's a very good reason, by the way, why, you know, I think when you are looking at newspaper articles that come from leaks, in my experience, quite often there is a grain of accuracy, but it's also very important to remember that the person who is responsible for the leak may not be in possession of the full facts. They might be someone who's working in one part of one department, and they aren't seeing the whole picture, and so sometimes they're wrong.
Is one question I've been asked by a number of core participants to ask is whether there should be an investigation into the sources of those leaks. I think the Prime Minister indicated that you wouldn't say if there was going to be an investigation because those who were responsible might then would then know. But what more generally is the approach of government when information like this is leaked? I appreciate there may be leaks all the time, I don't know, but this is a context in which I'm sure you would agree it's incredibly important that the first people to know about what's happening are, whether it's through Parliament, an announcement in Parliament, or directly to those infected and affected. That's the correct mechanism, not through leaks to the media, given everything that's been suffered by people over the decades. So what would be the approach to trying to find out who had leaked and what their motivation was?
I mean, I agree with you. The right mechanism for these announcements to be made is through Parliament and directly to the families who've suffered. In my experience, I'm afraid leak inquiries are very, very rarely successful. I don't think I can remember one where there was a successful identification of the person who was responsible, and so I'm not sure that really solves the problem. But I just would stress that although these stories are written up in a very credible way by very credible publications, by journalists who are trying to tell people the truth, it's really important to remember that the person who is responsible for those kinds of leaks may not have been in possession of the full picture, and it's quite important not to overinterpret as a result.
I'm just going to move on to ask you a little about the approach to the modelling that's being undertaken, not in any detailed sense, and not expecting you to have a grasp of how financial modelling is undertaken or to be able to explain that to us in any kind of detail. But in terms of the numbers who might claim, you'll no doubt be aware, and Mr. Quinn made express reference to it in his witness statement, that the inquiry has the benefit of a report from an expert group of statisticians which sought to identify through statistical modelling and on the basis of the evidence available the likely numbers of individuals who over the decades may have been infected with HIV or hepatitis C. And the figures are obviously large. And I know you've been provided with a summary for the purposes of today's evidence of what those figures were. But can we be assured that the government, in looking at the potential costings, is going to focus on what the likely number of claims will be, rather than the theoretical likely number of people who may have been infected over decades?
Well, I saw those numbers, which you kindly supplied me from memory. It was about 46,000 people might have been infected, of whom I think 1,300 HIV and the rest HCV, or most of the rest HCV. And that is a much higher number than, I think it's the 2,900 who are thought to have died tragically as a result of the scandal. All I can say is that we are gathering all the evidence we can from all the sources we can. It's very helpful to have the expert independent statisticians' views, and we are looking at those. And of course, we are trying to estimate as a result of those what the total cost to the taxpayer would be likely to be in different scenarios. That's the reason we have to do this detailed work.
If we can just look at, not rather than the statistical summary, but a document which I know has also been sent to you, which is INQY 40456. So this is a note which sets out, on the basis of up-to-date information from the current 4 devolved schemes, it sets out, first of all, the numbers of registrants within the scheme. And so you have at the bottom of the page, in terms of infected persons, the total figures, and then the figures in relation to bereaved partners. So you can see there a total, Mr. Hunt, of 4,519 across the entire United Kingdom of those infected and bereaved partners. Obviously, it doesn't include wider relatives because they have been not included within the schemes. But we've got there a figure under 3,500 of living infected persons claiming, registered. And then if we go over the page, we've got the data for the number of interim payments made. So there you will see, and this is pursuant to last autumn's payments following the summer announcement and the first interim report. Infected persons who received interim payments, 3,503, bereaved partners, 900. There's another category which is explained. So a total of 4,430. So those figures, would you, and I'm not asking you to commit to particular figures, it's just the general approach, Mr. Hunt. Perhaps a good guide, possibly the best guide, but certainly a good guide to the number of claims that might be expected on a compensation scheme from infected people will be to look at the numbers currently registered, because all those infected have been able to register if we leave aside the categories who hepatitis B and who can't obviously be included within these figures. And the numbers who made applications for interim payments is going to be not a bad starting point, if I can put it that way, for a realistic assessment of how many of those infected might look to the compensation framework. Well,
I think you're suggesting that I should take note of your suggestion on this, which I absolutely do. But I would say that we, I think, use those numbers as those are the people that we made the interim payments to. So, you know, we recognise the importance of those groups, and they're the groups that we prioritise for the interim payments because we are able to do that very quickly. But I don't think I can say more because the second interim report makes further suggestions as to other people who should be entitled to compensation as well.
Yes, absolutely. It's really just in terms of identifying the numbers infected, and then you will, I'm sure, be aware from your own work as Secretary of State for Health that there has been a scheme prior to the 4 devolved schemes, which happened under your watch when you were Secretary of State for Health. There were the Alliance House organisations, as they're called, which included, in relation to hepatitis C, the Skipton Fund, making payments since 2004, since 2011 making payments to those who had, the estates or those who died prior to 2003. So there's 20 years worth of evidence there. It's not realistic, is it, to think there are going to be thousands of people who've never made a claim previously now materialising to say that they too were infected with HIV or hepatitis C and wish to seek compensation.
I mean, that's the kind of thing we have to give proper consideration to. I don't think I can give you any further help on it because we haven't made any decisions about that. But certainly our starting point is the people who are on the registered schemes.
Well, the inquiry does hold data about the numbers who made successful applications to the Skipton Fund. It is public on our website, but if there is any assistance that can be given in that respect in terms of providing that information, please do let the inquiry know. Can I then just turn to perhaps look at the kind of figures we're talking about in very rough terms and try and put them in some kind of context. Billions sounds obviously a lot of money and a lot more money than the total of the interim payments made last summer. A number of core participants in relation to this particular point have drawn to my attention a range of other spending commitments, such as the, I think, 14.9 billion write-off by the Department of Health and Social Care in relation to COVID, in relation to PPE and COVID items. But I want to perhaps give a slightly more directly relevant context in terms of clinical harm. And so could we look, please, at RLIT 302162, please? Now, this is the annual report and accounts for 2021-2022 of NHS resolution. Are you able just to help us and understand the role of NHS resolution?
Yes, NHS resolution is the body that essentially is responsible for compensating people who've been harmed by the NHS in its day-to-day functions. Someone who's had an accident in surgery applies for compensation. NHS resolution is the body that's responsible for that.
And if we just look, I think we only need to look at one passage for the broader points. If we could go, please, to page 5, Lawrence. This is the chair's welcome in the report, and if we pick it up it's the left-hand side of the page, please, Lawrence. So if we could zoom into that left-hand side. Thank you. And then it's the right-hand column of what's on the screen, Mr. Hunt, and I'm going to pick it up in the 3rd paragraph down. Irrespective of all the above achievements, the cost to the public purse of responding to clinical negligence continued to rise over the last year, with damages payments under secondary care clinical schemes increasing by 10.3% to 1.775 billion, and claimant and NHS legal costs also rising. The biggest single influence on our provision remains the long-term discount rates set by Treasury. The 2021 discount rate reductions have increased the forward provision by 42.6 billion to 128.6 billion. This is an accounting provision that will further change with future rate changes. And then this. Another important figure to focus on is the provision for CNST. Now, as I understand it, that's clinical negligence in relation to hospital trusts, as opposed to negligence in relation to primary care. for claims arising from incidents in 2021 to 2022, which is £13.3 billion, a figure we have referred to previously as the annual cost of harm. Removing the effect of the Treasury discount rate change translates this figure to 8.7 billion, which is comparable to previous years while remaining a very significant sum. So, the purpose of referring to this, Mr. Hunt, is just to get some kind of sense that when we're talking about billions of pounds in the context of a potential compensation scheme, it's right to understand, isn't it, that in terms of clinical harm through the NHS, that is measured in billions of pounds every year.
Yes, I think I can tell you the amount that it was actually paid from memory was 2.7 or 2.8 billion pounds last year. So there's a difference between liability and how much is actually paid. And I think it's around 2.5 billion pounds. And personally, I think that is criminally high. And I think the reason why it's so high is because we don't learn enough from mistakes. I think that's one of the very important purposes of this inquiry, to make sure that we learn from the future. And I mean, if you look at, for example, maternity, we spend, which is the bulk of, I think it says actually in the next paragraph.
It's about 50%.
Yeah, it says 62% of hospital clinical claims, but about 50% in total. And we spend more on maternity claims than the entire cost of every obstetrician and maternity nurse in the NHS every year. So it's an appalling waste that we do this, and we need to be much better at learning from mistakes. But yes, I'm afraid it is a case that, I have to say, this is not just an NHS issue. This is the case in healthcare systems around the world, that they have these sums of money, which we would not have to spend if we were better at learning from mistakes and had more open and transparent systems.
And just to be clear, and having had the pleasure of having read your book, Mr. Hunt, for last year's evidence session, the reason you use phrases such as criminally wasteful, or whatever the precise phrase was, is not because you're saying the people who were harmed didn't deserve to be compensated. It's because the whole focus of your book was to try and stop the harm occurring in the first place, and thereby saving the cost of having to compensate people.
Absolutely right. Yes, no, of course, if someone's been harmed, they deserve compensation. That goes without saying, but they would, by the way, their incentive, in my experience, is never about money. It is, they want to stop these injustices happening again. But what they would prefer 1,000 times over is that that harm hadn't happened in the first place.
And I won't take time going to it, but your book gives other figures about NHS-related costs in terms of those who acquire hospital infections such as MRSA. The estimate of being it costs the NHS a staggering £1 billion per annum. So the purpose of flagging those figures up, Mr. Hunt, is really just to say this and invite your comment on it. Although the figures that have been talked about, at least in the media, are expressed in billions, in the context of the provision of compensation to people who were harmed over decades through their NHS treatment, would you agree that it helps perhaps put that in context when we look at those who, the kinds of amounts we talk about each year for those harmed by the NHS?
Well, I do accept that, we waste billions every year because of clinical harm in the NHS. It's important to say that there is a slight difference, because the argument I think around 10% of the costs in modern healthcare systems are putting right clinical mistakes. So that's a huge amount of money you could save if you didn't make those mistakes in the first place, and that certainly is billions. A second element of this is the £2.5 billion we pay every year as compensation to right a wrong. In this case, I think it's more about the latter. It's about righting a wrong. It's about dealing with a terrible injustice that has gone on for a very long time.
Now, if we could just go back to your witness statement, WITN 3499034, and back to paragraph 11. We read out paragraph 11 previously, and I said I'd come back to that last phrase while recognising the wider economic and fiscal context. Now, I just want to, if I may, try and unpick a little with you some considerations that might feed into that. Of course, as Chancellor, the economic and fiscal context no doubt lies at the heart of what you do day in, day out. Just want to explore with you questions of how that fits with the decision-making, in general terms, as a matter of principle, with the decision-making that falls to the government in relation to the recommendations of the second interim report. You told us last year, as we've already established, that the government refused to hold an inquiry for years because of the fear of having to pay compensation. And you told us also it was undeniable that the inquiry should have happened decades earlier, and you talked about that being a big failing of state, a lack of openness, and other ministers have given evidence to similar effect. Had there been an inquiry decades earlier when you suggested there should have been, but for the government's unwillingness to be landed with a bill for compensation, had successive governments not delayed, then the question of compensation, the decision on compensation, wouldn't fall to be considered at a time of financial restraint. The proposition I want to put to you in general terms is that's a problem of the government's own making, I mean by that successive governments, and that should not be a reason to either refuse to compensate or water down the compensation that might be payable, because that would be penalising the victims for the government's own delays.
I think the way I would phrase it is this. The first decision you have to make is, do you believe justice should be done? In this case, do you believe that compensation should be paid? And the government has decided it should. Then, if you like, the problem goes to the Chancellor, but we haven't got to this stage yet because the small ministerial group has not made its final recommendations. We're still going through what Sir Robert said and what the second interim report said. And then the Chancellor has to then make a judgment about what is affordable in the current context and how to do justice in the context of the economic and fiscal situation. And you're right that it might be the case that it would have been easier if, well, it would certainly have been easier, and it would certainly have been more right if this had been resolved 20 years ago, unquestionably. And it's a terrible scandal that it wasn't. But life doesn't go in straight lines, and you know, this has happened now, and you know, nor were we expecting at this time to have to fund the defence of Ukraine with, you know, £2.3 billion this year and £2.3 billion last year. But you know, that's the timing that was out of our hands. It was decided by Vladimir Putin. So that is what government is. You have to make decisions that come across your desk to the best of your ability. It's a very uncomfortable thing for me to say, but I can't ignore the economic and fiscal context, because in the end, you know, the country only has the money that it has, and so I can't ignore it. But I think everyone here should take some comfort from the fact that the government has decided there is a moral case for compensation and justice should be done, and that is a very big change. But we now have to work through the fact that you're right. This is a much more challenging time to find the sorts of sums of money that this could potentially involve.
Well, perhaps I leave it again as an invitation, Chancellor, when those decisions do fall to you, to ensure that 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 proposition, and as a point of general principle, is part and parcel of the decision-making process. Would it also be fair to say that had government acted, and again I'm talking about successive governments or government in general rather than any one government, had government acted sooner, it might well have cost the government substantially less than it may do now?
Well, it wouldn't just have cost less, it would have been more just, and it would have meant that many hundreds, if not thousands of people would have died knowing justice had been done, even despite the incredible agony that they and their families have been through. So I think that goes without saying.
You've told us, I think, or given us your reflections on the pace at which the government is currently working. Can I then just ask you a couple of general questions in relation to that question of impact of delay? Do you accept, does the government acknowledge in its decision-making processes that the delay in taking a decision, the delay in implementing any compensation framework, inevitably compounds the suffering of those infected and affected, and thus compounds the injustice they've already suffered?
This has been going on for far too long, and justice delayed is justice denied, and that's why we have a responsibility to work as fast as we possibly can to resolve this, given that people are dying every week, and so we need to make this decision. It is a very challenging decision. I don't pretend otherwise, but we need to resolve this as quickly as we possibly can, and that's why Penny Mordaunt commissioned the Robert Francis compensation report, so that we could start to get our head around the potential routes as far as compensation is concerned, and not have a situation where, when the final report is published, there was then a very long period where the government worked through different compensation options. So that's why we are doing all this work contemporaneously to you finishing off your final inquiry recommendations.
You say in your statement, I don't think it's necessary to put it up on screen, but I'll just read it. You say it is imperative that the government acts quickly to give the infected and affected the certainty they need over this issue, and I'm confident that the government is doing so. You've obviously told us in your oral evidence this afternoon a little more than we knew previously in terms of the magnitude of meetings and so on. Is there anything else you can tell those listening that supports your confidence that the government is now, at least, leave aside previous periods of time, is now at least acting quickly? Because you'll understand, Mr. Hunt, 2017, when the decision's taken to set up a public inquiry, we have Mr. Burnham calling for compensation now. 2019, we have Dame Diana Johnson saying, let's not wait till the end of the inquiry, let's compensate now. We have Ms. Mordaunt in 2020 saying, action is long overdue, I cannot stress the urgency of action enough.
You had Jeremy Hunt saying it in 2022.
Yes,
so,
we did, we'll come on to that, don't worry.
But I think the way I would put it, if I may, Ms. Richards, is that because I happen to have had a lot of experience at this issue, being the person who persuaded the then Prime Minister Theresa May that it was the right thing to hold this inquiry, and having had a long experience of it, having met remarkable people like Mike Dorricott, my own constituent, who sadly passed away. So I happen to have a lot of personal interaction with people who've been affected by this scandal, and so I do understand why there is a very, very high degree of suspicion. When I originally persuaded Theresa May that we should I have to say, without difficulty, I think Theresa May has a very strong sense of social justice. But when I made the recommendation that we should have the inquiry, I was Health Secretary, and I was quite surprised that the families were so adamant that the Department of Health should have absolutely nothing to do with the way the inquiry was run. And that kind of showed me just how much suspicion there was of the department which I was responsible for. So I understand there is suspicion, but what I would say is that if the civil service had been given a steer by ministers that we don't want to do this, we want to kick this into the long grass, we want to find a way of burying this into the far distant future, that is an awful lot of meetings to have and an awful lot of policy papers to put together. I appreciate that from the outside it feels like the government is working painfully slowly, and I appreciate the moral urgency given that people are dying. But I am satisfied as Chancellor that the government is working very fast to try and resolve this as quickly as possible.
Can I move to it's a related but slightly different point, and pick it up with you by reference to a statement made by Mr. Quinn in December 2022 to the House. COLL 5022, please, Lawrence. And if we go to page 4, please, just for context, this is the 15th of December, and it's the date upon which Mr. Quinn made the statement in which he accepted, or he articulated the government's acceptance of the moral case for compensation. If we pick it up, it's the fifth paragraph beginning, I cannot commit to a timetable. And then he refers to there being a complex series of steps to be taken. And then he says this: I assure on members that it's my intention to update the House as we make progress. We must do so in order to ensure that those infected and affected are fully apprised of the progress we are making. Now, you've referred to the suspicion and lack of trust, and you'll appreciate, Mr. Hunt, that the less people know about what's happening, the greater that suspicion and lack of trust, which in itself is damaging given the psychological harm over decades. Mr. Quinn has made further statements to the House, but they don't contain details of progress or concrete information about progress, still less anything that could amount to keeping people fully apprised. Now, there might be two explanations for that. One is that the progress has not yet been made. The other might be it's been made, but the government is choosing to play its cards close to its chest still. Does the government understand how important it is to try and give some information when it can to those infected and affected, such that even if there are still matters to be worked out, the form of an arm's length body, the need for primary legislation, whatever it might be, but that some decisions in principle could at least potentially be communicated, even if lots of details and matters of practice still remain to be worked out?
I completely accept the importance of communicating as much as possible to families who've suffered for very, very many years on this. This decision is, we've had Sir Robert Francis's recommendations, we've had the second interim report. We are now in a situation where we are doing the very detailed analysis of what the likely cost might be of implementing those recommendations, and then understanding the constitutional, the fiscal, the economic implications of all of those. And we have this system in this country where we don't give a running description of that decision-making process, because we do need to allow ministers the chance to have frank discussions in private, so that that is actually, it will sound to people listening like secrecy, but it is important to have to give people the chance to say what they really believe in government meetings without having to think, how is this going to play if it appears in a newspaper tomorrow morning? You genuinely do get better decisions that way. Now, I think we're in that situation now where we're going through the analysis and we're trying to understand the issues. But what I would say to people who are nervous that not enough progress is being made is that we have had an interim payment that is a big sea change. We've had an acceptance by the government that compensation will be paid, so that's another very big change. And we've had the second interim report, and I hope we're not too far away from the final report as well. So I think this issue is making progress towards the conclusion.
When Ms Mordaunt announced the commissioning of what became the Robert Francis Compensation Framework Study, what she talked about was having advice on potential compensation framework design and solutions which can be ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry. Now, upon the conclusion of the inquiry suggests a close temporal relationship between the conclusion of the inquiry and the implementation of the scheme. So not the inquiry concludes and months go by. Is that still the aspiration of the government in general terms? Again, I'm not asking you to commit to particular dates, but that it would be upon the conclusion of the inquiry as opposed to months afterwards, not least because, as you'll appreciate, given your decades of political experience, general election potentially next year, PERDA, could lead to an extraordinary length of delay.
I completely understand why that's a very, very important question for you to ask on behalf of all the families. But because we haven't made a decision on the compensation and we are in the process of trying to understand that, and we all want to make a decision as soon as possible, I can't give you a sense as to the timescales. But what I can say is the fact that we commissioned, or that Penny Mordaunt commissioned Sir Robert Francis to do his report, is because we did not, precisely because we did not want what you fear on behalf of the families the most, which is that there would be unnecessary delays in a third stage, so get the inquiry and then, you know, a very long time before the compensation is announced. The fact that we're doing this work now is because we want to be in a position to resolve this issue as soon as we possibly can upon the conclusion of the inquiry.
Now that leads to the next topic I wanted to explore with you, which is the question of waiting for the conclusion of the inquiry before making a decision, which is what your statement tells us is the position. It's what the statements of the other ministers who've given evidence this week tells us is the position. And I'm going to ask you the same question I've asked other ministers this week in hope of clarification. Why... I understand you tell us, Mr. Hunt, that work is still ongoing, so you can't yet announce something that you haven't decided. But the coupling of the decision-making process with the conclusion of the inquiry in terms of the production of the inquiry's final report, what is it that the government thinks it's going to learn from the final report that's so essential to its decision-making that it has to wait when it's already got Sir Robert Francis, the first and second interim reports, its own work and so on, and it's already accepted the moral case for compensation?
Well, it was always believed that we would make this decision after the inquiry's final recommendations were made. When I, back in 2017, argued inside government that we should do the inquiry, I didn't imagine any other route than that we would allow the inquiry to make its final recommendations. And when you're deciding what to do, not mine that is being given out, it's taxpayers' money, it's the money of every single person in this room and the whole country outside this room. And because the sums are potentially very large, I think it is right that the decision is made with the full context of understanding not just how much, but why these things happened. And I think that we will make a better decision as a result of that. But what would not be acceptable would be for that moment to be another hiatus where there was another very long period of time. I think the fact that ahead of the final conclusions of the inquiry that we paid compensation, we paid interim compensation, and we've accepted the case for compensation, and we are doing the work now to understand what the final amounts should be, indicates that we want to make the process as quick as we possibly can. But I think you will say some very important things in that inquiry, and I know that you're not going to say any more on the levels of compensation that you think are necessary, but I think you are going to help us to understand a lot about the context. And I do believe that it is responsible and right to the taxpayers who are funding this for government ministers to see the full context of the horrific scandal that this was before we make the final decision as to how the compensation will work.
That wasn't the approach the government took to the first interim report. We heard obviously from the Prime Minister on Wednesday an explanation to the effect that it was government practice and precedent to await the final outcome of an inquiry report so its recommendations could be considered in context. But the government didn't feel it necessary to do that in response to the first interim report. And I think a lot of people struggle to understand the difference of approach. Can you assist any further in relation to that?
Well, I think the fact that, I wasn't in the government at the time that decision was made, but I think the fact that government recognised the need to make interim payments is an indication that the inquiry has had a big effect on the government's thinking. I think when the inquiry was originally commissioned, I don't recall any discussion of interim payments, and the fact that the government did accept the recommendation to do that showed that its thinking had evolved. I think it had learned from some of the things that, the evidence that you had heard in the inquiry. But I think it is also not just reasonable, but right, given the sums that are involved, which are potentially very large, that we should see the full context before we make our final decision.
To earlier witnesses...
I think, to be fair, as I understood the question, it may not have been entirely clear, but I think Council was asking you not so much about the final compensation scheme, package, whatever it is, but about further interim payments to classes of people who might merit the receipt. In my view, they do merit, but I say might because it's a matter for decision, might merit further interim payments. So it's the parallel situation, if you like, just for different people, recognizing that it may be some time before the system, whatever system is set up, provides the compensation to which represents a full and fair and just settlement. That I think is what Councillor is asking. Am I right?
In fact, I was asking the wider question, which Mr. Hunt understood. I was going to come on to the narrower question next. I do beg your pardon.
I've misunderstood. But I've asked your question for you, have I?
You have. I'm going to come back to interim payments, but before I do, the Chair has asked a question, Mr. Hunt.
I think the straightforward answer to that question is that we haven't made a decision on those wider groups. That is an intrinsic part of the discussions that we are having in terms of the whole package, and we just need to make a lot more progress.
Just dealing with the general question of waiting for the final report, I have suggested to earlier witnesses this week two interpretations that could be placed upon that and invited their comments. I'm going to suggest the same to you, but a third has been flagged up to me by others, for which I'm grateful, which I'm going to explore too. So Some are concerned, perhaps many are concerned, that the reason you're waiting, or I say you, I mean the government obviously, are waiting for the final report is that because the government didn't start the intensive work until really this year, it's the government's own delay that it effectively gets masked by waiting for the final report. The other concern is that by waiting for the final report, the inquiry at the point it ceases its work no longer has any powers, and the government could ignore the inquiry's recommendations with impunity in terms of any powers that the inquiry might have. Do you have any observations on either or both of those matters?
I don't really recognise that as being fair. I will say, I need to say at the outset, I don't think over the decades to date that the people who've been infected or affected have been treated fairly. So this is not, I'm not in any way trying to absolve the state of its responsibility for a terrible scandal. But I think that if you look at what the government could reasonably have done in the circumstances, I wasn't in the government until the end of last year, but Sir Robert Francis's report came in June. The decision was made, I think, in August to pay.
Sir Robert Francis's report was delivered to the government in the middle of March last year,
but
with a promise that the government, sorry, I won't use the word promise, with the government saying it would produce a response before he gave evidence, and never has.
Okay. But I think about 6 months after that report, the government announced that they would make interim payments. And that is a very, very big change in the posture that governments over very many years have taken. And then 4 or 5 months after that, this government accepted the moral case for compensation. I know you will disagree with this, Sir Brian, but permit me to say it. I think the government did take a reasonable position when it said that it wanted to know what you thought about Sir Robert's recommendations before it could progress. And so, because if there was going to be any difference between what you said and Sir Robert said, then that would have a bearing on our decision. So I think it was necessary to have your second interim report, which is extremely helpful. And then I think you see since that moment this really quite dramatic increase in the amount of work going on across Whitehall. So all governments have a very big share of the responsibility for the fact that this has taken, half a century to resolve that injustice. But I think these things are now moving very fast in Whitehall terms.
The third concern that's been expressed to me by a number of individuals, and therefore I'm articulating it to you to invite you to comment. You may say it's unfair and wrong, but it gives you then that opportunity to do so. It's been suggested another reason why the government might want to delay making a compensation announcement until after the final report is that such an announcement would be designed to take the sting out of the publicity, the press reporting that might come from a highly critical final report, and turn it into a good news story. Now, if that were the case, I'm sure you would accept it would be unacceptable to place the reputation of the government over the needs and interests of those infected and affected. But you may tell me that you may be able to give an assurance that that's not the government's thinking.
Can I just say this very plainly? There is no good news story in this scandal, none whatsoever. It is a terrible, terrible scandal. So that is absolutely not our thinking.
Can I then come back to the question of interim payments? So as you know, the second interim report has recommended interim payments for cohorts of individuals who have never previously received any compensation nor financial support from the support schemes. And in particular, I have in mind, as I'm sure you understand, parents whose children died and children whose parents died. And you'll have seen in the second interim report some of the examples of the testimony of those who have suffered such unspeakable losses. Can we put up on screen, and you knew I was going to ask you this, I'm sure, Mr. Hunt, the letter you wrote last summer when not in government. So it's WITN 3499035. This is the joint letter that you wrote with Andy Burnham and Matt Hancock. And you say this, 3rd of August, addressed to the Prime Minister. Dear Prime Minister, we're writing to urge you to authorise the making of interim payments to all victims and all bereaved partners of victims of the infected blood scandal with immediate effect. As recommended by the Infected Blood Inquiry Chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, on the 29th of July, those payments should be worth at least £100,000 per award. As Health Secretaries with a combined period in office of 10 years, we passionately believe that this is the vital next step towards justice for those who have suffered dreadfully over the decades as a result of this scandal. The victims and their families deserve nothing other than the complete and immediate acceptance of Sir Brian's recommendation. To refuse to do so would simply continue the injustice thus far handed out by the state to a group of innocent victims condemned to years of suffering and neglect. Any delay to such payments, for instance by arguing that we need to wait for the inquiry to finish, for a new Prime Minister or for Parliament to return, will sadly almost certainly see more of the victims die before they see justice. Already more than 400 people have died since the inquiry started, with some estimating that one infected person is dying every 4 days. Waiting until even the end of the year when the inquiry hearings are concluded would mean another 40 people would die. The number would likely be above 100 if the government waits until the inquiry has reported in full. This is simply unacceptable and will cause yet more harm to a group of exceptionally vulnerable people. You have the opportunity to leave a lasting and positive legacy and start to put right a terrible injustice that others before you have failed to do. We urge you to grasp that opportunity before it's too late for yet more victims and their families. And I think you published that with a tweet that read, contaminated blood victims need a decision from Boris Johnson to authorise immediate payments. Postponing this will see more victims die without justice, a letter from 3 former health secretaries. And the question therefore, Mr. Hunt, is why isn't that same sense of urgency applicable to those who have received nothing, no support even from the financial assistance schemes? Why is that urgency not applicable to them and to the specific recommendation in the second interim report for interim payments to be made?
Well, I think we do need to go as fast as we possibly can with those other groups of people. We have now got both Sir Robert's recommendation and the second interim report, but I know this will disappoint people listening, but there are some very big recommendations, not just in terms of the amount of money involved, but for example, the idea that the amounts should be decided by an independent arm's length body without any reference to ministers. We have to think through how the accountability of that would work. I'm not aware of that structure ever having happened before, but this is obviously taxpayers' money, and these are potentially very, very large sums of money. So the need to see justice for families who are affected, bereaved mothers and fathers, and people who lost their own mother and father is very much something that we recognise is important to do. But we have to do a lot of work to understand both the potential amounts. It's harder to calculate the potential amounts because those people aren't part of the schemes, the AHOs, in the way that the living infected and the deceased infected are. And so there is complexity, but what I would say, just to sort of reassure people who are worried this is being kicked into the long grass by the government, is that this is very much part of our discussions. You made some very clear recommendations, Chair, and we are going through every single one of those recommendations, trying to understand the potential cost of the taxpayer and the best mechanism to make sure that justice is done.
One practical step that I think was certainly raised in the House by Dame Diana Johnson, and I think has been raised in correspondence from campaign groups with government, would be the possibility of starting a registration process for those who would fall within the recommendation 12 in the second interim report. So as to ensure expectations are not dashed, it can be clear that the registration process does not mean a decision has been taken to make the payments, but it would have two potential benefits. It would give you, the government, a clearer idea of potentially of the numbers involved, and it would mean that if the government does decide to make payments to those cohorts of people, whether it's as an interim payment or as a final payment, they're already registered, and that would minimise any further delay. Is that something that the government has yet thought about? And if not, is it something that can at least be... Again, I'm certainly not asking you to commit to a policy. I understand you can't do that. But is that something that can be thought about or inquiries undertaken as to its feasibility?
I mean, you're very elegantly trying to guide me to talk more about where our thinking is going on these. What I would say is, in terms of those doing something like that, I mean, that would be one element of a huge number of new processes that would need to be set up, new organisations that would need to be set up were we to implement the recommendations of the second interim inquiry in full. And we have to start by making the full decision as to what we are going to do, and then we start to make those processes, set up whatever processes are set up. But I think it would be, I think it would be confusing to set up one process and not another when we are making good progress in trying to make a decision as in its entirety, and that's our objective.
Mr. Hunt, my final questions to you are, I'm going to ask you to look at two documents. One is a letter you wrote to a constituent, an email you wrote to a constituent, not in office, I hasten to add. And the other is a letter that was sent, I think, to you by Andy Burnham yesterday. I just want to put those on the screen, read them, and then ask if you have anything that you can feel able to say in response. So the first document, please, Lawrence, is MRIC 601. And we can see this is an email dated the 18th of July 2019. It's to a constituent of yours, Melanie, and I name her with her permission, I should make that clear. You say this in the second main paragraph: if I'm lucky enough to become Prime Minister, pausing there, this was obviously the time of the 2019 leadership election, I will do all I can to ensure appropriate compensation and other actions to give justice to those who suffered. However, I do think that we should allow the inquiry to do its work, to tell us what the next steps should be before we commit to them. One of the reasons I push for a full public inquiry is because it would have the power to require witnesses to give evidence, and its findings would carry huge weight. I now think we need to give Sir Brian Langstaff the freedom to do his work and reach his conclusions. Now, it may be said the inquiry has, through its second interim report, told you what it thinks the next steps should be. Obviously, it's a matter for government as to whether it accepts those recommendations. And that waiting for a final report is not consistent with that prioritisation that comes across in your email here, but also what we've been told by other ministers this week is the government's priority to this issue. Is there anything further you feel able to say in relation to that?
To be honest, I don't read that email as being any different to the position that I'm saying this afternoon. I think you could read that email and fairly say that I did want the inquiry to conclude its work and publish its recommendations. But I also want to act as quickly as possible. And I think that, I can't see the date of that, but that letter, that email looks to me like it was sent around the same time as I wrote the letter with the other two former health secretaries.
No, this is 2019.
Oh, this is 2019.
Yes.
Okay. So, and it's some time before, but but I think, you know, I would want to do something to, well, as everyone knows, I did want interim payments to be paid as quickly as possible. But I think that is consistent with my view that I want to hear the inquiry make its conclusions.
So the last document I'm going to put on screen is Mr. Burnham's letter, HSOC 00299112. It's dated yesterday's date and says this: Dear Chancellor, last August we wrote together as former health secretaries to the then Prime Minister calling for interim compensation payments to be quickly made to victims of the infected blood scandal. We wrote that letter along with the Right Honourable Matt Hancock MP because we all appreciated that a failure to act and act quickly would continue the injustice thus far handed out by the state to this group of innocent victims. When you appeared on the Today programme to discuss the letter, you were clear about how important it was to resolve the question of compensation. As you said, we should do it right away. We've waited far too long. Successive governments, which I was part of one, didn't act as quickly as they should have, and we need to recognise this as a terrible, terrible injustice. Your words are as true today as they were last year. At least another 100 victims have sadly passed away since we wrote that letter. Like thousands of others, they died without the closure that full compensation and justice can bring. You are now back in government. You have the power to right the wrongs of the past. You will give evidence again to the inquiry on tomorrow. When you last gave evidence, you talked about the shared responsibility that those of us who have served in government have in terms of how long it has taken to resolve the infected blood scandal. Your words now as Chancellor can bring either hope or despair to those whose lives have been so damaged as a result of what we know is the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. I implore you to take this opportunity to let the infected blood community know that they still have you as an ally fighting in their corner. They need to know that you have earmarked funding for compensation, that the present financial situation, which is not their fault, will not be a barrier to them receiving what they deserve. Finally, that you will use your good offices as Chancellor to ensure that the compensation scheme will be in place for when the inquiry issues its full report later in the year. Now, Mr. Hunt. Mr. Hunt, a number of the themes which Mr. Burnham there sets out, I've explored with you already in your evidence, and you've given your response in relation to that. But is there anything further you feel able to say, with all the constraints you've told us about in terms of collective cabinet responsibility, but anything further you feel able to say that would give that hope or that confidence or reassurance about this not being something kicked into the long grass, but something that is utterly a priority for this government?
Well, I believe before, you know what I believe because I gave evidence to this inquiry a year ago, and I believe then as I believe today that this is, it's not just a terrible injustice, but, you know, politicians need more than words. They need to show with their actions that they are putting into practice what they believe. And I can understand that it's very frustrating for people listening that I can't go into details about discussions that are going on inside government. But I do believe that the actions of the government, and I should also say that I don't know what the decision is going to be because the decision has not been made. So I have to give those provisos, but I would also say that the actions of the government of which I am part, to me, demonstrate a seriousness of intent to resolve this issue in a way that finally does justice. And we are doing the work necessary to understand everything that we need to understand, given the potentially large sums of money involved. I hope that we can avoid any unnecessary delay in resolving this, and I hope that you will see that in the actions that the government takes going forward. But I do appreciate that this is a very frustrating process, but I do believe that the government's view is different to the many governments that have preceded this, and I do believe that we are closer to justice, but we have to look at all these very, very difficult decisions and go through these processes, and I hope we can resolve things as quickly as possible.
So those are the questions I have for Mr. Hunt. We obviously need to take a break in any event for the stenographers, but also if we could take the break now, that provides core participants with the opportunity to suggest any further questions that they want me to consider asking Mr. Hunt.
Yes, well, you know the process, that the core participants will give such questions as they have to Council to ask you when you come back. And we have to give everyone a chance to have a break, a proper break. So what do you think, 40 minutes?
If we say 35, well, it's up to you, sir. It's entirely up to you.
Well, we're arguing only about 5 minutes.
Quite.
So let's say 40 minutes. If it's going to be any longer, you'll be told. And that means we will come back at 4:15, is it?
4:15.
Quarter past 4. So 4:15, please. Now, remain where you are, seated, as we discussed earlier, and the Chancellor will leave, and you'll see you again at 4:15.
And the usual warning for the witness.
And, of course, you're giving evidence. You may not discuss the substance of your evidence, anything you have been asked or anything you think you may yet be asked, with anyone, whoever that anyone may be.